Assalamu alaikum, peace be with you and welcome to Islam and Life with me, Tariq Ramadan, broadcasting from London. In today's show and for the occasion of Al-Quds Day, we ask the question, what is the Islamic perspective of the land of Palestine?
65 years into its Israeli occupation, the Palestinian cause remains at the forefront of all Muslims fighting against Western imperialism and injustice. The calls for a free Palestine have increased, with a rise in awareness activities and events across the world, highlighting the oppressive Israeli regime which has murdered, orphaned and displaced millions of indigenous Palestinians. The boycott, divest and sanctions movement has forced Palestine into mainstream headlines by successfully engaging international figures such as Stephen Hawking and encouraging them to boycott Israel on all levels, including academic, social and arts. As Palestine continues to win over millions of hearts, the question on its importance in Islam still remains. This week's Islam and Life asks, what is the Islamic perspective of the land of Palestine?
We have been talking about the Middle East a lot these last years, about what is happening in many countries, what happened in Tunisia, what happened in Egypt, and it's as if while we were talking about all this unstable situation, uprisings, revolutions, spring, we forgot one country. We forgot the Palestinians and their legitimate resistance, and it's as if this is the forgotten people in the whole process in the Middle East. While for more than half a century, almost the beginning of the 20th century, the resistance to the colonialist project, the Zionist project in the region is there, was there, and still remain a central issue in the region. And there is this Al-Quds Day, which is important, reminding not only the Muslims, but all the people who are on the side of the oppressed, that there is one issue that we need to solve. It's not only an Islamic perspective, it's not only an Islamic concern, it's something which has to do with human rights and the human dignity and the freedom of one population that is oppressed. But there is also something which is connected to the Islamic principles, connected to the Islamic tradition, connected to the Islamic history. And we need to get a right understanding of what is and what could be the Islamic perspective on this resistance and this legitimate resistance to oppression. These are questions that are important because very often we listen to people making it only a religious issue and others making it a political issues. What is exactly at stake there? In which way the Muslims should react? In which way they should be involved? And to answer all these questions, I'm joined by my guest lecturer in Islamic Studies, Amir De Martino. Thank you so much for being with us today. Let me start with this first question, because it's true that over the last few years we have been talking a lot about other countries and less about the legitimate resistance of the Palestinians against the Zionist occupation and what is happening there. Now, from an Islamic perspective, why and how do we look at it as a conflict which is central in the region?
Well, from an Islamic perspective, of course, there is an historical Islamic perspective, which is to do with a strong religious symbolism, which is Al-Quds, the center of Palestine, is the first Qibla, the first place where the Muslims began to pray under the leadership of Prophet Muhammad, and after that was shifted to Mecca. And so the symbolism, the importance of this event and other events in the history of Islam from this Muslim perspective is settled. The Quran mentions it, and so there is a connection between Islam and the world of Quds and Palestine. And so, and Islamists never made a huge claim of taking it over and removing everybody from there. There's never, Islam recognizes that it's a place equally important to other faiths, Judaism and Christianity. And so throughout the history, when Islam has held the position of caretaker of those lands, it has always allowed other faith and other sort of denomination to practice their faith. And in fact, Palestine remained throughout the history, even when Islam took over, a place of pilgrimage for Christians. Albeit small incidents during the Seljuk time where there was some restriction, but apart from that, Muslims have always managed it very nicely and allowed other faith to be part of this land.
So what would you, before we come to this, because
Yeah.
I think the point that you are raising here is very important, is how the Muslims, when they were ruling there, when they were in charge, the way they were respecting all the other traditions. Before that, what would you respond to people saying, yes, okay, it was the first Qibla, it was the first direction, and so what? Why do the Muslims, or should the Muslims care so much about Jerusalem, about Al-Quds? Why is it so important for them in religious terms first, just to get this? Because very often the people here, even, I'm talking with Europeans and parliamentarians at the European level, say, we don't understand. It's as if you are as obsessed with the land as the Jewish communities. How would you respond to that?
Well, of course, the land of Palestine, in terms of ethnicity, remains a strong connection with the Arabs. And the fact that when Islam moves out of Arabia, encounters this first population of Arabs living around Syria and things, the connection, the transition from Arab to Islam is almost a natural process. They accept it and so culture also becomes part of the land of Islam in very early, when Islam bursts out of Arabia, takes over those areas quite easily because they have much in common. Those populations, they are not Byzantines, although they are satellites of the Byzantine. The Arab tribes are ethnically the same as these early Muslims, and so is assimilated within the milieu of the Islamic faith, and so it remains. But of course, Islam doesn't claim, as I said earlier, that this should be a holy place only for Muslims. But this is
so let me come to this point,
Yes.
because you are raising an important point, which is, we had the Jewish qualification of the Israeli state as the some Jewish trends, and even the government is saying this is the very essence of our state, the Zionist project, connecting
Yes.
a religious belonging or affiliation to a political one.
Yes.
From an Islamic perspective, if we look at the history, if we look at the tradition, the way Muslims were dealing with Al-Quds was quite different from that. What were the specificities of the Muslim faith? You said something which is acknowledging the presence of the Jews,
Yes.
acknowledging the presence of the Christians,
Yes.
and in which way? What does it mean to acknowledge the presence?
Well, acknowledge is, first of all, ensure that the other places of worship are maintained and respected with equal reverence. Of course, the Nativity Church, which is the place where one of the most important prophets of Islam for us as Jesus is as equally important as it is, not the same as Christianity, but certainly has a fundamental role to play within our faith. And so the places of worship were kept throughout, soon after the Islamic army sort of entered the area. And it has remained like that. There's never been an instance, as I said, there are small period in history, like the time of the Turks, the Seljuk, where reports of certain restriction to the pilgrims were put, but this was far in between. And overall, the history of the maintenance of those holy places in the hands of Muslims has always been very, very, very sort of positive.
Positive,
Yes,
tolerant, respectful, and
yes,
open. Yeah.
Aware that this is a land of great importance to the Christians, and because Islam sees itself as the last revelation and incorporates all the other, we have no problem in respecting places where other prophets have walked upon, and so it is part of our faith. Naturally, we are in much stronger position to assimilate and accept previous revelation than the other one who are more exclusive and they stop. And so
if we look at the conflict now,
yes.
and the way the Palestinians are oppressed, and there is an ongoing colonization with the settlements, with people, civilians being armed on the side of the Israeli and the colonizers, and on the other side people trying to resist. If we look at it from an Islamic viewpoint, what would be a religious Islamic solution to this conflict?
Ultimately, and throughout the history, even when Palestine was occupied for briefly a period of 200 years by the Crusaders, we never saw a mass movement of Islamic army moving across the Muslim empire to go and free Palestine. It remained actually a local issue, so much that in the history of book it's also treated as a period of annoyance for the Muslims, rather than, because it was brief. Although the memory, it's quite hard. The massacre that the Crusaders sort of perpetrated in that area shocked the psyche, but it remained a local issue. And at the end of that, it was a local people who were able to get rid of the Crusaders. Saladin was in a sense was from the area, and so in that respect, it's something that has never involved too much. But now we are talking about the 20th century, a conflict, taking over a land, and the dimension of it, the creation of the State of Israel, the imposition of, in a modern context, of taking over a land where people are effectively living there before. They were living before.
Yeah, yes, there is something which is new now, because at the beginning of the 20th century there is something which is not only a process of colonizing a country, but to install and to set a state and to say this is ours, and even to respond to what was happening in Gaza and the massacres. We have the Prime Minister Netanyahu saying this land belonged to us, or have belonged to us for the last 3,000 years. He is using the religious justification to explain why it's right and not wrong or legitimate to go and kill innocent Palestinians. So there is a use of the religious reference.
Yes, the use of both sides. But I think from a theological point of view, I understand that from a Judaic point of view, this claim is questionable. In fact, there are factions within Judaism that
and new historians even that are coming with new visions about this.
This idea of creating a state, and also if you look at the makeup of Israel, is not made up of a religious element. It's made up of secular, very strong secular elements which are brought across from. So this is it is a political design which has used religion and sort of fed also on some extremism within Judaism, and that sort of a marriage of political design, Zionist design, with extreme elements in Judaism, which has created this Frankenstein, which is really.
And there is also, new Jewish historians coming back to history and saying the Arabs and the Muslims who are now the Palestinians are in fact all the old Jewish communities who converted to Islam. So in fact, when you come back to the origins, you will find that these Muslims were the old Jews of the country, of the land. Now, if we look at what is happening and say, look, we have to be very cautious not to make it a religious conflict between Judaism and Islam. And this is where the religious voices should be heard, is also to bring on board the Christian voice, because they are, and the Quds Day should not be the day of the Muslims, but the day of the voices coming from the three religions, being able to say what you said at the beginning is the holy places, the holy should be respected in an equal footing. Do you see this as possible?
Ultimately, that is my personal opinion. Time is against Israel. Things are changing, and demography is changing, and yes, they're still able to keep and hold all those territories. But time-wise, is playing against Israelis, and in general, there is also much more awareness
around the world.
Around the world, it's no longer
with all these campaigns that we're referring to in the clip about.
Yes, I think
BDS
it's one of these issues which has attracted the attention of so many people across the world, ordinary individuals, for the sake of justice. All over, they leave everything and they want to help, and so it's one of those causes which finds groups across the world, from Europe to America, ready to do something, because it's a recognizable case of injustice. And of course, this makes it even harder for us to understand how it's possible that the world is not able to stand against this kind of oppression. And it's a domino effect. Until that one is brought down, we will not see changing in another part of the world. Because
it's so central.
It's so central, yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And
so let me come to one point. We hear voices, and especially in the West, but not only, we also have people in Muslim majority countries saying we have to avoid making it a religious conflict and to come to the political side.
Yes.
It's in fact a political conflict.
Yes.
While it's very difficult, in fact, not to come with a religious positioning here and saying, look, if we look at our tradition as Muslims, for example, the only way forward is for all the religions first to acknowledge their presence and equal rights as to the holy sites. But other voices are saying that's all fine, but in fact it is a political discussion that it's needed, and it has to do with politics. What would be your answer to that?
Well, certainly, as far as the management of Jerusalem or Quds, that can certainly could take shape in a cooperation of faiths. But this is Quds, which is a pearl which stands on its own. But the rest of Palestine, it's a land which was inhabited, where individuals made a choice centuries ago to convert to Islam. And so if the majority of them and those who have been expelled obviously return back, it means that still we will become a majority Muslim sort of land. And on the basis of that, on the basis of justice, they would have as much saying, probably more saying than the rest. But that doesn't mean that the rest should be excluded. And I never believed that this was the case, even at the time prior to the creation of the State of Israel. Even the Ottoman Christians lived there, Jews lived there, and so this is possible. But the majority, at the end of the day, Palestine should be ruled by a coalition where the majority make up the identity, and the majority in this case will be Palestine. Of course, the demographic is forcibly been changed over the last 40, 60 years, and so but the right to return can readdress all this issue and give the identity which Palestine naturally will take. Which is
I met with many European parliamentarians and many politicians at the highest political level in Europe and in many European countries, as well as here in Britain. And the people are using your argument by saying, look, you Muslims, you are for the role of the majority and following the majority there in Palestine, because you know that if the Muslims and the Arabs are coming back, you will be the majority, and it means the end of the Zionist state. In fact, what you are saying by saying or talking about the majority, what you want is the end of the current state of affairs, and to do something which is in fact to take over. What would be your answer to that?
Well, at the end of the day, if we have assessed that those who were expelled forcefully had the right to return, then it will be they who once have returned and they formed up some kind of political entity, that they will have to make the decision on how they want this political entity to be shaped. And yes, Palestine is at the heart of Islam, but we are not. Our faith is not undermined by Jerusalem being a multicultural place. We can still have a place here now. We can put aside the religious aspect of it and focus on the justice fact of it, or implement it find a solution to one of the most unjust sort of casualty of human injustice.
Which, by the way, it's something which is important, is to say we abide by the principles, and the principles, whatever they are, it's based on justice, it's based on the majority process, and this has to be done there as well as everywhere, which sometimes is the other way around. We have some Western voices, they are for democracy when they control the majority.
But this is it, this is the hypocrisy of...
So this is yes, and especially there. Now, my question about this is, we are talking about the Al-Quds Day, celebrating the centrality of Jerusalem and Al-Quds for the Muslim conscience and the Muslim communities around the world. When we see what is happening around the world, when we see how global is this local conflict, this local conflict is in fact global. What should be during these days, but beyond that, the role of the Muslims around the world when it comes to Palestine and the situation of the Palestinians?
Well, I mean, the publicity of an event which started out of small suggestions in early 1970s when Imam Khomeini first, and in fact it was interesting when you read the motivation that Imam Khomeini put together to sort of to propose this global day of Quds was because of what was happening in Palestine. And it's incredible that 65 years later, if you read that message, why Imam Khomeini issued a statement because of the suffering and the torturing, and it's still there.
So and sometimes worse.
Yes, in fact, it's worse than in that respect, and so it becomes as relevant as yesterday. And so, the fact that this it's becoming, in a sense, more internationalized, it's benefiting not only the Muslims, but benefiting the Palestinians themselves. And I think I know many Palestinians who, before they were afraid of showing themselves publicly, and once they saw that this is now an international cause, they've changed their identity, their approach themselves, they've given more confidence to themselves. And so we as Muslims should continue to do that and organize better Quds Day, involving as many other faith as possible to make this day of the oppressors, really.
Thank you so much for that. I think that during this discussion, what you raised as are critical points. The first one is, once again, to come to history and to understand that from an Islamic perspective, the acknowledgement that there is a Jewish presence, a Christian presence, and a Muslim presence there is the starting point of the very understanding of Islam and the essence of Islam. Not only in principles, but through history, this was the case. There were exceptions, but the rule was mainly mutual respect and proactivity in the region. The second thing which is important is not to make it something which is Muslims against Jews, but the voices, the religious voices coming together and being able to say equal rights for all the religions. And the last point is, yes, there is a political discussion, and this political discussion sometimes is instrumentalizing religion. This is what the Netanyahu was doing. And then this is where it's important once again to make it clear that we are talking about justice, we are talking about autonomy, we are talking about the rights of the oppressed to resist oppression, and also to be able to say something about the oppressors, as you said. And this is the very essence of this day, but to remain aware of what is happening for the Muslims around the world. And the last point that you made, which is important, it's not a Muslim issue. It's a universal issue. It's a global conflict that Muslims and people of other faiths, Christians, Jews, Buddhists, and atheists and agnostics should also be part of this struggle in the name of the oppressed against oppression. Thank you for that. That's all we have time for. Please let us know your thoughts and views on any of the shows we have seen. And here is the way to contact us.
Islam and Life welcomes your opinion. So please send us your suggestions as well as criticism on any of the shows you've seen or would like to see. You can share your thoughts with other Islam and Life fans, engage with debate, and view past shows on our social media platforms. Tweet us at Islam and Life TV or join us on Facebook by liking our page Islam and Life on Press TV.
Finally, I would like to thank my guest, Amir De Martino. Thank you so much for your insight, and I hope to see you next week inshallah.